All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about the celebratory episode. This is the 5th anniversary and the 344th episode of this podcast. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. I mean, seriously, who does not love a little bit of percussion? It's kind of finding it. I decided to use that because I started off my music career, which did not go anywhere, as a percussionist and a drummer, playing the xylophone, timpani, drum sets, all that other stuff. So I thought it was really cool to include that. Thank you for joining us here at Inside My Canoe Head. Today, we're going to talk about the celebratory period of a 5-year anniversary of Preparedness Podcast that was grounded in our experience of the pandemic. We're going to hash a little bit of that out. We're going to talk about what it means to be a podcaster in today's environment. And then I'm going to give you the list of the greatest takeaways from 5 years of interviews and conversations with humanity in the field and the phenomena and the philosophy of preparedness. And then we're going to talk about some of the biggest barriers that I think currently exist in my nation of Canada that's probably generalizable everywhere about the state of preparedness. So first and foremost, I owe a huge appreciation to the people who supported me along the way. Number one, my beautiful and incredible wife, my best friend, my kids, confidant, the one person, Tina, in Germany, who consistently and regularly gives me reasons to continue smashing away at the keyboard, as I like to say, and coming up with ideas. And all of the listeners, we are just about at 33,000 listeners in over 111 countries is where we are. And the point of all of this is that the message of preparedness is universal. It is across socioeconomic barriers, across vulnerable and marginalized populations, from democracies to socialist and communist countries to around the world. We have theocracies. Greek gods are in the base. No, theocratically run places. We have monarchies, we have communist nations, we have democracies, we have countries who think they're democracies, but they're really not. We have downloads across the world. There's probably about 190 countries in the world, give or take who you believe is emerging next, and 111 are listening to this podcast. So I think it's pretty eminent, pretty clear that preparedness is important, that people are interested in the phenomena and the philosophy of preparedness and the bigger conversation, right? Because I started this podcast, the first episode was April 28th, 2020. So obviously 5 years later today on April 28th, 2020, which just happens to coincide with the Canadian election, we're releasing the 5th anniversary episode. And when I look back at the other 340 plus episodes that preceded this one, you understand that the purpose where we emerged and why we started this podcast was generated out of the pandemic. Now, the virus arrived in Canada in November of 2019 after the international military SISM games that were happened to be occurring in Wuhan, China. And in March of 2020, the government of Canada, along with many other governments, declared a pandemic, and we began the period of government policy and interventions into our lives. When we think about coin phrases we used to have, like 2 weeks to flatten the curve, 6 feet for safety, and there were a whole bunch of other ones. But we started to immediately go into a period, and I remember March of 2020 clearly, how uncomfortable I felt, how uncertainty was dominating the atmosphere that we were all living in. I remember looking at the roads and nobody was on them. And I was thinking, I could have played ball hockey in some of the major roadways in my neighborhood, and I wouldn't have had to yell car and move the nets out of the way. It was just a phenomenal experience for humanity to go through. Not from the sense of glorifying it, but the sense of it was such an abrupt change. Now, those of us that have studied natural disasters, pandemics, and other things in the past, obviously we did not see this one coming, But we knew that we hadn't had a pandemic in close to a little over 100 years, and they're cyclically usually more frequent than that. So we were very overdue. It's like sitting at overdue for the big earthquake off of Cascadia Fault in British Columbia on the western coast of North America. Consistently say you're overdue, but what does overdue mean, right? Does that mean the Yellowstone volcano explodes? Does that mean we're about to have we're overdue for an asteroid hit? Or you could go on, but the idea is that a global pandemic was known to many people as a potential possible exogenous shock that could hit society. We had learned in Canada in 2002 and 2003 during the SARS-CoV-1 endemic that we lost a number of lives here in Canada, and we did some lockdowns in Toronto, and we did some contact tracing and locking individual families down that we could related to that virus. That virus was different because you weren't contagious until you were showed symptoms. So if we could contact trace really well and lock people down before they showed symptoms, then we could actually contain the flow of the virus, which was different from SARS-CoV-2 in 2020, is that the virus turned out to be contagious, period. As soon as you were infected, you were contagious, likely long before that you knew you were. So contact tracing and that type of thing would not have been able to shut that down. Obviously, we tried to do that because it's the process and procedure that we knew at the time. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just what the data and the processes and policies we had at the time. And so we learned from that. So in 2003, the Canadian government set up something called Public Safety Canada. And it's a ministry in the Canadian government, and it basically brought together a lot of areas, kind of like what the Americans did with the Department of Homeland Security post 9/11. They realized that there were a whole bunch of important agencies that were interacting in the same space but didn't have a coordinating function. Now, whether the Homeland Security was successful or Public Safety Canada was successful is a different argument, but we understand the impetus why they were created, to bring together with the idea that we would collate all the smart minds, the smart ideas, and the things that were going on. So Canada created this. And part of the pandemic preparedness that was created in the Public Health Agency of Canada was simply that we would have a team of people who were doing medical intelligence. So these were teams of experts, some in the military, some in CSIS, and some in other areas. CSIS is our Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And so they were looking outward. They were looking at the world, examining the world, and understanding the pathogens and threat profiles that existed around the world. So we actively had people sitting 24/7, staring out, getting ready for preparedness. We thought we had a preparedness plan. Each individual province had some type of pandemic plan at the onset. None were coordinated with each other, and none were coordinated with the national pandemic plan, but we actually had a group of people. Now, as a result of a political decision, those people started to look at the opioid crisis in, I think it was around 2014, 2016, and started to steer a lot of the knowledge base and a lot of the skill sets away from pandemic surveillance towards the opioid crisis, which was real, impactful, and today still kills thousands of Canadians every year. The issue is that we never really took pandemic preparedness seriously. And so when a pandemic did hit us, along with the rest of the globe, we didn't have stockpiles of PPE ready to go. We didn't have a national preparedness strategy. We didn't have a national pandemic strategy, and we didn't have a strong communication strategy, which resulted in very confusing messages. And so what happened from the pandemic is that we ended up having a lot of controls imposed in Canada, right? And it happened to a lot of countries around the world. But when you think about all of the impositions that were put on Canadians, who was ready for that? Which Canadian was prepared for an exogenous shock that would impact how they lived their lives, which meant that they were prepared to deal with the financial impacts, at least, for 5, 6, 8 months of having no family income, right? exceptionally few. And this was the key that lit the fire and said, oh, hold on a second here. We have a country of people who are not prepared for their own outcomes. They're not prepared to take care of themselves. And as soon as we had a global pandemic, and as soon as we had significant impacts in Canada, there was this incredible reliance and dependency on government programs, whether it be businesses, whether it be individuals. Everybody needed, or the vast majority of people needed money from the government to get by. It was an absolute dearth or absence of preparedness within the population. And this was what fired me up. And I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why society had decided to live, because choosing not to become prepared is an act of choice, right? Choosing not to do something is a choice in and of itself. Now, I get there. Nobody gets up every day and going, I wonder if I'm prepared for a disaster. But we do things to ready ourselves for risks that are beyond our control, right? You buy car insurance. You buy house insurance. Maybe you wouldn't if you weren't legally required, but all you had to hear about was one person losing everything to an insurance claim and realizing that, yeah, you know what, I actually need to have this. So you look at people weren't prepared. So I was wondering why. So I started the podcast with the idea that we need to investigate and ask the questions why people were not becoming prepared, why people chose not to adopt preparedness, why people did not have sufficient financial funds to take care of themselves, why people did not have pivot plans to switch to their own financial future, and then why did people have poor mental health? Why are we living in such a stressed and anxious time where you add the pandemic into it and we have a dearth of people having mental health problems, or a large amount, of people suffering from mental illness? The questions that I didn't know the answer to them, right? As a scientist, I had a number of hypotheses. And in 2020, I was about 50% of the way through my PhD, which was really funny because I was studying emergency preparedness communications at the municipal level in the province of Ontario, Canada, and nobody could care less what I was doing. Not a thing. As soon as the pandemic kicked off, all of a sudden, everybody in the university was interested in my research. I was listed as an expert, got a bunch of calls from news media to talk about things that were within my wheelhouse, and a couple of them I denied. I got one invite to go on a CBC TV panel to talk about preparedness plans at the provincial level. And I said, I'm not your guy. That's not my area of expertise, and I don't want to go on national TV, BS it, or look like a fool. So I turned that one down. I did end up being on CBC's Marketplace. If you're interested in that, we did a great show on disaster preparedness for natural disasters. It was season 53, episode 1. Look at their website. The link to it is in my Substack article I wrote this morning. So I did get a CBC TV gig on that. But the point being is that we really wanted to understand why. And so we began this research and continued my PhD, obviously, but carried on the research through Inside My Canoe Head. And then subsequently, I started a company in July of 2020 called Preparedness Labs Incorporated. And that was, I realized there needs to be some formalization of the research that we were doing at the podcast. There needed to be some organizational block or position around it for who owns the research, right? And the reason for that is you have to be very careful if you ever work in the academia space, right? So the research and the products that I generated as a result of my education and using the services of the university, the intellectual property lies at the university, right? It's just the way it is when you're doing graduate education or PhD education. So if I was going to do research, if I was going to do a lot of detailed analysis outside of what I was pursuing in the PhD about the lack of preparedness in the Canadian population, I needed to put that inside a box. And that box was a corporation. So I created it in July of 2020, and it's still an ongoing. We were profitable last year, for those of you who are interested. And it is possible as a veteran in your 50s to create an entrepreneurial venture that does become profitable, but after 3 years of losing a crap ton of money. But this is how you learn lessons. But so I was able to put the research into that box and protect it and own the intellectual property of it. And so The tagline came out really, really early on because a lot of people were talking about the apocalypse coming. A lot of people were talking about societal collapse and that we were going to revert to a tribal society in North America, that the federal government would come down. You know, the show 24, if you remember it, when they blew up the U.S. Capitol and everybody died, and then everybody wanted to, the states would go independent. And a whole bunch of this stuff was on TV at the same time. And so I realized that if I wanted to be considered a reasonable, truthful, and accurate voice within the space of preparedness communications and talking in a podcast about, and it was also the boom of podcasts. Everybody was starting a podcast in the pandemic, or you're starting your own YouTube channel or something like that. We all heard about pandemic projects. How do I distinguish my voice from that which is all over YouTube, right? Which is your prepper channels, the societal collapse, get your bug out bags. Here's the top 10 things to invest in and all of that. And so the tagline came up pretty really quickly. And it was, I am the CEO of non-apocalyptic evidence-based preparedness education for rational people. And that's exactly what I do, right? So as a scientist, you shouldn't care what my belief and opinion is. You should care the evidence that backs it up. And so it often gets people a little ired when I'm talking to them as a scientist, and I say, you know what, I don't care about your opinion, right? I really don't. What I want to know in a situation is, what does the evidence tell us, right? And I've harped on this on many a podcast, but it's really true, because I have a belief and opinion, and I'm going to communicate that to you in a podcast. But my difference in this, what I offer to differentiate myself from everybody else, is I actually do the research, right? I actually go out and I pose questions and I run surveys and I interview dozens and dozens and dozens of people at various levels of government and community organizations about the philosophy and the phenomena of preparedness. I bring the evidence, and then when I tell you, yes, it is my belief and opinion, but it's based upon hard published evidence. And then I said, okay, well, nobody's going to believe me if I just tell them it's true, right? In today's world, everybody tells you true. So Jeff goes the next step, and I started the Journal of Preparedness in Canada. And it's not on the website right now. I had a website crash issue, but we're going to fix that. In the next week or two, by May sometime, it'll be back up. But we have a Journal of Preparedness in Canada at the company. And what it is, it's free. It's an online, it's an EPUB. We kick it out 3-4 twice a year, whatever the demand might be. And we publish our research in there. So when I tell you that social ties are the most important thing for you to do if you want to be prepared for a disaster, is to build relationships, I'm grounding that in evidence. And if you go over to JPIC, our publication, the evidence is there. That's where I publish the research that says this is true. And this is the research. Have a look at my data of why I'm telling you this. And that's why I'm trying to put a little bit of credibility into preparedness communication. So I said this to a friend and a very good trusted mentor in the podcast space, and also my canoe partner. He basically said, you are my friend because you don't do that apocalyptic stuff, right? He basically said we wouldn't be friends if I was selling doom and gloom for clicks. And I didn't. And I haven't lost money, but I've left a great deal of money on the table because I did not go down the road of apocalypse. I did not decide, I decided not to stand up here and make sound like society is going off. I could have made tens of thousands of dollars a month in profit by selling a whole bunch of BS that was not based in evidence, but it gets a ton of clicks, right? And it's all over YouTube, and that's fine. It's not that they're doing something wrong. They're doing something I disagree with, but welcome to the world of freedom of expression in Canada, or free speech, First Amendment in the United States of America. Here you are. But that's not what we do here at Inside My Canoe Head. We produce evidence-based information. So we grounded it in that saying and say, okay, everything that we say on this podcast, all 340 episodes, has to be grounded in evidence. If I'm challenged by a listener, or if I'm challenged by a news organization, or any voice out there challenges something that I put on the air, do I have the evidentiary support to back it up? And if I don't, then I don't say it. Now, have I been 100% accurate on that? I'm thinking pretty darn close, but nobody's perfect. I actually made two notable mistakes where I talked about things that, in fact, it was a stretch, an exaggeration, and one of them I got called out on, and the other one I apologized in the follow-on episode. And the apology was true because it really wasn't me. I thought this was to be true. I just got really excited and fired up at the microphone and recorded a bunch of sentences that were how I felt, but was not grounded in the evidence. So I had to walk that one back. And then when I had a listener call in or send me in an email and challenge some data that I had, I went back and checked the data, and my data source was poor. It was. And then I went and I checked. And so I had said something along the lines that, 70% of the people had lost trust in government. And in reality, it was a sliding scale where 30% had absolute trust, 70% had a sliding scale of mistrust in the government. It didn't mean that 70% of the population had lost trust in government. It's the way I chose to phrase it, and I got corrected. And this is what I love about being a podcaster, and this is why I love about putting my email out there. My email is jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. That comes to my inbox. Nobody else in the company has a look at it. I get it all. I am untouched or touchable or reachable by any one of my listeners in 111 countries. And I intend to keep it that way because that's how I keep honesty and integrity in what I do. And am I a top podcaster? No. Do I have paid advertising? Yeah, actually, I pay about $3 or $5 a day on meta ads. And what that does is it gives you a boost. And you know what my meta ad is? You've probably seen it. It's just the picture of Canada's #2 preparedness podcast, which is a standing joke amongst a bunch of friends of mine. And that's because I gave a speech at a conference in Northern Ontario, and I opened it up by saying the key to saying you're the #2 preparedness podcast is nobody checks the numbers. If I was to stand up here and tell you I am the #1 preparedness podcast in Canada, somebody out there is going to Spotify or Apple. They're looking at all of the preparedness podcasts that are available in Canada or sourced from Canada, and they're doing a comparative analysis, and I'm going to get challenged. When I say I'm #2, nobody does. Why do I say I'm #2? Because I have the data to back it up. Right? It's, again, back to the core of what I do. I'm not #1. There is a podcast that talks about preparedness in Canada that has a higher degree of reach and downloads. Now, is it just downloads? It's more reach and downloads when you look at it, but no, I'm not #1. But that's pretty cool, right? So I set out that advertising, the picture that my incredible wife made for me with the podcast logo, and that goes out on Meta, and I spend $3 to $5 a day, and that's just money from the company, right? It's profit from the company that goes towards keeping the podcast alive, because podcasts cost money. And if you're thinking about a podcast and you're thinking about putting it out there, then I would, because it's your voice, right? It's the public square of the modern age. When we think about the old, you've heard the phrase of, get off your soapbox when people are preaching, sounding preachy or something about that. Well, that actually goes to the day when we didn't have radio, we didn't have telegraph, that people would gather in the public square, which was usually your downtown square in front of your halls of legislature, or in a bar or saloon, but mostly outside in the legislature. And what would happen is people would have competing viewpoints, and you'd see debates and arguments. And so a soapbox was a literal wooden box that soap was delivered in. And people would flip it upside down, and they would get on top of it in the corner of the public square, and they would start yelling their message, whether it was the Lord is coming to save you, or whether preparedness is the #1 thing in the sliced bread, or who you voted for was a dumb thing. So it was people got on the soapbox to stand above the crowd to spread their message out, whatever their message may be. Roll society ahead a couple hundred years, and podcasting, as part of the social media online square, is the new public square. So this is my opportunity to put forward what I think is reasonable and interesting to my listeners in an important part of society that I am an expert on, and I have spent well over a decade researching individual preparedness communications, and community resilience. I've written a master's thesis on it. I've written a PhD thesis on it. I've published 2 books. I have a journal. This is my world, but I need to stay within it, because the funny part about what happens is people have an area and a niche where they are an expert, but then because they're an expert in that field, they go on and they try to comment about everything else, right? We did some interesting stuff over the last 5 years in this podcast. I got into Putin. I got into the Ukrainian conflict and a whole bunch of other international fights. I had a lot of conversations about Donald Trump and his rise to the presidency a second time. But I always approached it from the angle of, I'm not trying to tell you that Putin's a good guy, and I'm not trying to tell you Trump's a good guy. What I'm trying to say is there is a rational understanding of why people do what they do. And it's something that I'm very much interested in. And it's tied to why I started the podcast, right? I did not understand why people were choosing to not become prepared, whether they're making that active choice to not become prepared. And there's a whole bunch of things. We're going to get that to in a moment. But when I was talking about Donald Trump and Putin and various other world leaders and world events that I would talk about, it was trying to understand the why. Not whether I agreed with it, not whether you supported it or your friends or anybody else supported it, but simply from the perspective of the why. Why were leaders doing this? You know, from Putin's perspective, it was understanding why did Vladimir Putin feel he had the need and had to invade Ukraine when he did? Why was that time the time in which he had to do it? And what was his rationale? Again, it's not about whether you agree with it. It's not about whether you think it was a good idea or not. It's not about what you think the response was a good idea. It's why did this event occur? And understanding why that event occurred from the perpetrator's point of view can very much assist all the rest of us in understanding what are the preparedness and precautionary measures that we can take. Because remember, preparedness is about natural disasters, economic, political, familial, cultural, ideological events, all of these things that happen to us that are beyond our control. So, and when I mentioned my friend Tina in Germany, and a fantastic human being, I haven't seen her in probably a decade now. She was doing real day-to-day humanitarian work, moving from Europe into Ukraine to assist those affected by the war, and was looking for some preparedness information, precautionary advice, that type of thing. And so I provided that, and that was a real-world impact of some of what we do here at Inside My Canoe Head. And it's part of what keeps me motivated to get up every day to say, you know, I'm putting out 2 episodes a week on average. Some weeks they're 1, some weeks are slightly delayed, depending on what's going on. Season 14, we're committed to this. We're committed to getting 2 episodes a week out. Now, for those of you that are new here and are still listening to us at minute 28, what we do here is we produce every week or twice a week, we produce a written article, a podcast episode, and a YouTube video. And they go up on our 3 mediums so you can consume what we have in the written form, the audio form, or the video form. And each one of those go up twice a week. We put out probably 5 to 10 little reels and fun things starting the 1st of May on all of we're on TikTok, YouTube Reels, Instagram Reels. So we put that up there. I'm on X. What I talk about on X is a lot more hands-off and a lot more focused and unapologetically me. So if you're interested, I'm at Preparedness Lab over on Twitter, but feel free and understand that you're going to get a little bit more blunt force trauma, shall we say, by being over there. That's just the nature of X and the platform, which I think is a good place for that. We all need that conversation. But that being said, this is what we do here at Preparedness Labs Incorporated and on this podcast, Inside My Canoe Head, is we provide you non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education. So let's have a quick boo at what the big lessons learned from the last 5 years. The first one is preparedness is where the response fight is won. And that simply means once a balloon goes up, especially for rapid onset, no notice events, we deal with the calamity with what we have prepared, our attitude, our strategy, and our relationships. It's very much similar to a modern army. You fight with what you have, not with the one you on order, not the one under procurement plans, or one that you have planned in a government policy document. Next one is preparedness is free. Your success in navigating an event is grounded in your decision to accept responsibility for your outcomes, to the decision for you to create a personal strategy to deal with things that are beyond your control, and then to build the necessary social networks to support your better post-event outcomes. The third finding, the acquisition of commercial goods is not correlated with success, but gaining knowledge and skills are. And those are available across the internet on free platforms, but it does require you to make a conscious effort in time and concentration to be successful, but not money. The perceived financial barrier to preparedness is a construction of the state, the agency that posits the purchase of something will improve your preparedness. Maybe I can buy something, drop it in your living room, and you'll all of a sudden magically become better prepared. There's no evidence to support that whatsoever. The fourth finding was social capital is your superpower. The relationships you create with your community are the key variable correlated with better post-event outcomes. So when I put my researcher and academic hat on, the research is fairly homogeneous to the extent possible or desirable. The single most impactful action a human can take to increase the likelihood that they will have an easier time in a calamity and emerge less harmed is to have strong social bonds. These relationships are the glue that holds society together, and they're the lubricant that allows other capitals to flow. Financial, human, and physical capital flow along the lines of relationships. You lend money, skills, and time to people you know, not necessarily strangers. The next lesson was Stoics were right. There is so little we control, and that is perfect. You know, we're exposed to a flurry of exogenous shocks, ones that impact our lives, including how we choose to earn an income, where we live, our families, and even our soul. We cannot control or prevent disasters, but we have absolute control over how we choose to respond. That is the foundation for the strategy argument, the idea that your ability to navigate that which you cannot control is a plan you create to mitigate the impacts. A specific analysis of a few key areas of your life equips you to counter all but life-ending events. And the last one, saying the quiet part out loud is helpful to those who choose not to. Now, I say a lot of controversial things on the podcast, things that people may disagree with, but it's more times than not, and based upon the feedback, not just my thoughts, but based upon the feedback that I get, much of the time when I speak, it is about things that people are concerned about. It is thoughts people are having, but they're just not comfortable in saying them out loud in a public setting. So I get to do that for them, right? You know, I ventured into the Ukrainian fight, the U.S. election, censorship, changing world order, the end of globalism, regionalism, ideological cultural wars, national policy, and other important topics. I mean, I even spoke on the length at why, to this day, I still think Canada's emergency management system is a gold standard at the national and subnational level. At the local level, no. But at the national and subnational, yes. You know, I'm unapologetically truthful and blunt. I say the quiet part out loud, and you have to deal with it. We need to improve the quality of discourse and return to a sense of normalcy in our debates. Policy matters and buffoons do not. That alone is near impossible for some to grasp, and I hope you all get the reference at who I'm talking about. So those are some of the lessons that I learned and the big things that emerged from 5 years of preparedness podcasting. But really what I want to end off on what I think are the greatest barriers to adopting preparedness in Canada, and you can probably generalize this to your country. The first one is preparedness communications. The standard of Canadian public sector, resident-facing preparedness communications is abysmal. It's a tough nut to crack, right? There's a significant sunk cost bias in there. We have seen some small but notable movement in the periphery. Some jurisdictions are beginning to edge away from the have a kit, be informed, make a plan message, which was appropriate for a time and a world that existed 40 years ago, not for today. I've published hundreds of pages of thoughts, peer-reviewed research, and podcast episodes fighting against this paradigm. The government is simply not providing useful information, and it is not seen as a trusted source in times of crisis. The rebuilding of institutional trust post-pandemic should be the current paramount task of the public sector. Next one is culture of preparedness. Aptly put by Brock Long, a former head of FEMA, of which I had the absolute privilege of being on a shared panel. And he stated it, our societies lack a culture of personal responsibility and readiness. And I've tied this to a 3-generational change. If we look at early Gen X, and I'm early Gen X, we are self-reliant. We have less of a need for government intervention or instructions on how to navigate chaos. I didn't need to be told to be careful when drinking hot coffee because the contents are hot, right? I didn't need a message on a direction to say don't get up from the driver's seat of a van to make sandwiches because it will crash, right? We didn't need any of these cautionary messages along the line because we could figure life out. As we move through the millennial, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and now into Gen Beta, there's a far less sense of what the individual is responsible for. There's a reliance on someone else to solve issues and provide support. We need, as a society, to return to adopting a culture of preparedness at the individual and community level. And it's best described by Damon Coppola, a stalwart voice and he writes many textbooks in emergency management. And he simply says, in a resilient society, emergency management is the redundancy. The government's resources are scarce, they're finite, and they're minuscule in comparison to the resources in your community. But we choose to rely on the former when the latter is the key to a resilient community. And that's something that we miss. We have everything we need. And when we think about risk management in the gig economy, right now, our society, we're moving from a society that was grounded in full-time employment with benefits to one where it is expected that you'll change industries, roles, and positions every couple of years. Individuals need to adopt risk management in their personal, financial, and professional lives. Like, you're not going to have a pension plan to contribute to for 30 years in a company to get a corporate or government pension. That's your responsibility. It is your responsibility to save for your retirement. It's not the government of Canada and society's role to pay your bills in your retirement. That's yours, right? We need to keep going along those lines and thinking about, there's a need in Canada for an education on supply chain risk management, business continuity principles, dynamic insurance models, right? How do you cover loss of income when you're in the gig economy? There's insurance models for all of this. Like, we have to generate an education to where we support the idea that the gig economy, it's where our society and our economics are transitioning to. So we need to build those supports so people understand that this is how they protect themselves. This is how they build a sense of preparedness. So they can have an Uber job. They can have a short-term, they can have a seasonal job. They can have an Uber job. They can have a mountain guide job or a wildland urban firefighter job that's only seasonal. And they can they can buy a house, they can raise a family, they can do all of these things on these gig economy jobs because we figured out how to navigate the preparedness piece. And the other one is emergency management in corporate Canada. And this is the last one that I think is huge. Part of a recent presentation that I made and what I intend to talk about in the fall at SEPSA in Edmonton once it's announced is resilience is a verb. Building the capacity to respond to and recover from events beyond our control requires all of society, including corporations, not-for-profit, and community organizations. Right now, there remains an ideological barrier in emergency management against the embracing of the private sector in response operations, even though they possess far greater physical and human resources than governments do. We're in a situation where we need to create the space where people can come to cooperate and communicate. Not that we want the command and control, because this is another barrier in emergency management is, and I've said this phrase that within a disaster, all 4 sectors of society are responding, right? So business has its own response operations. Community organizations do that. Individuals do it through their own preparedness plans. And then governments do it as part of their emergency management plans and activate their EOCs and all that, right? The government's not in charge. The government is a response, one of many responses. And they need to coordinate with other responses. The government of Canada, the government of Ontario, in an emergency in Ontario is not in charge. They're only in charge of their public sector assets and things that are responsible to the public sector. They're not in charge of private businesses. They're not in charge of people. They can't tell people what to do. They can't tell businesses what to do. They can provide great advice. And let me tell you, we don't want to live in a society where the government can order everybody around in an emergency, because that can get into really slippery slopes. And we saw some pretty big problems in the pandemic. So when we look at where the society is, we realize that within your community, if we go out to, maybe if you're in a small rural area, think regionally, likely all of the assets that you need to respond to disaster are already in your region. They're just not well coordinated, not well communicated, and nobody is sitting around the same table. We've talked about it at length. I will continue to talk about it unapologetically. So those are the big lessons that came out, the lessons learned, and what I think are the barriers going forward. I want to, before I close, I want to say that season 14 is going to be about consistency. We've got a plan. We've created this 10 years of work that we've done in emergency preparedness at the individual and household level has allowed us to create this plan called the 4-step 8-hour guide to resilience. And we're going to release that over the next couple of weeks in 4 episodes and 4 YouTube videos that will go coordinated with it, that will then be on our YouTube channel, part of a thing. So it is your roadmap. Should you choose to follow it, it will guide you and your family how to adopt preparedness, how to adopt resilience, and what are the exacting and specific things you can do within your own resources to make your family better prepared to deal with exogenous shocks that are beyond your control. We're going to offer that. It's over a decade of research and experience that has gone into it, and we're giving it to you for free. Why are we giving it to you for free? Because we are here to provide non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education to the public, right? Free of charge. And we love it. We think it's great. It's what we do here at Preparedness Labs Incorporated in support of Inside My Canoe Head. Now, I just want to close out to say it's been an absolute pleasure to provide non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education, to be Canada's source for rational and research-based strategies to navigate exogenous shocks. So I raise a glass to all that made the past 5 years possible, my incredible wife, kids, confidant, and a list of believers that convinced me to continue the message, to climb upon the soapbox in the public square and be unapologetically me. So I did, and here I am. Pro Patria, and welcome to Season 14. Take care, stay safe.